Okay, let's dive into this because we have literally all been there. A close friend comes to you with a massive life problem. You listen calmly, you instantly spot the patterns, and you lay out the absolute perfect step-by-step solution. It's brilliant. Honestly, you feel like a genius. But then you look at your own life. You face the exact same problem, and it is a total tangled mess. All that clarity you just had, poof, it completely vanishes. Welcome to this explainer where we're going to explore this fascinating and, let's be honest, universally frustrating mental model. It really begs a pretty profound question when you stop to think about it. Why is your advice for everyone else so much better than the advice you give yourself? Why are we such brilliant guides for our friends but such terrible navigators of our own lives? It's a contradiction that sits right at the very core of human nature, blinding us to the obvious solutions we so happily hand out to everyone else.
Well, the answer lies in a concept known as the Solomon paradox. Basically, it's the fundamental human trait of being vastly better able to reason wisely about the conflicts of other people than the ones we face personally. This is the big idea for our journey today, that profound, stubborn gap between knowing what is right and actually doing it for ourselves. It's a cognitive blind spot that literally spares no one, no matter how smart or well-meaning you might be.
To really grasp where this comes from, we have to look back at the paradox's namesake. There's this ancient proverb that goes, "The way of a fool seems right to them, but the wise listen to advice." This was written by King Solomon, the ancient ruler of Israel, who was famed globally for asking God for wisdom rather than riches. People traveled from all corners of the world just to hear his sage counsel. He was, quite literally, the ultimate dispenser of life-changing advice. But here is where the story takes a bit of a tragic turn. Publicly, Solomon was a beacon of sage judgment for his entire kingdom. Yet in his personal reality, his later years were defined by incredibly foolish choices. We're talking hoarding wealth, taking hundreds of foreign wives, and compromising his core beliefs. As our source material notes in Papa's take, Solomon absolutely knew the right things to do, but entirely failed to practice what he preached. Knowing wisdom and actually living it out are two vastly different things. So, moving from ancient history to modern science, psychologists Igor Grossman and Ethan Kross actually put this exact tension to the test. They wanted to know, is this paradox just some old morality tale, or is it a hardwired cognitive bias? Well, through some pretty extensive research, they proved that this asymmetry in our reasoning is a fundamental psychological reality. It's not just a character flaw, it's a built-in feature of how our brains process information the second our egos get involved. Now, what's really interesting about this data is that when the researchers asked participants to reason through someone else's conflict, their capacity for wise reasoning was off the charts. But when they were asked to evaluate their own conflicts, that wisdom absolutely plummeted. The science reveals something super fascinating here. Psychological distance creates clarity. When it's not our problem, our minds stay beautifully clear. We aren't bogged down by the immediate threat to our own self-esteem, which allows our logical faculties to operate at full capacity. And this brilliantly illustrates an old Chinese proverb: the bystander will always see more than the player. Think about it. When you are the player, you are completely tangled up in a fog of emotion, anxiety, and status. The personal cost just feels way too steep, so you hesitate. You overthink. But as a bystander looking in, you are clear, rational, and objective. You simply aren't tripped up by the emotional stakes, meaning you can see the entire board instead of just the one single square you happen to be standing on. All right, so we know the history and we understand the science, but how does this ancient cognitive bias actually show up in our modern day-to-day lives? How does the Solomon paradox manifest when we aren't ancient kings or subjects in a psychology lab? Let's take a look at a few vivid examples I'm sure you'll recognize.
Let's start with a classic internet staple, the Karen. You know the type, an entitled person super quick to publicly police the behavior of everyone else around them, yet entirely blind to how their own actions appear. As our source notes, his late father, Papa Q Bear, used to advise him to just simply be polite to folks acting this way because at the end of the day, they just lack self-awareness. Papa and his spouse, Colonel Debs, recognize that this behavior is literally the Solomon paradox in real time. It's opining on everyone else's faults while entirely ignoring your own lack of grace. They demand perfection from the world, but somehow always excuse their own explosive behavior. We also see this huge disconnect in how we handle our money. On one hand, you have active trading, which is so often driven by hubris, the desire to outsmart the market, and emotional gambling. Contrast that with the quiet, steady wisdom of index funds.
Papa's take reminds us that while we might logically know that slow, broad market exposure is the actual path to wealth, human greed always whispers these temptations of flashy shortcuts. True financial wisdom is ignoring all that noise and letting time do the heavy lifting, rather than letting the paradox push us into irrational, ego-driven choices.
And this paradox even bleeds into spiritual matters. Look at the Gospel of John, chapter 8, where Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees. These religious leaders were incredibly intellectually aware. I mean, they knew the scriptures inside and out. Yet, they were completely spiritually blind. They rejected the truth standing right in front of them because their hearts were so clouded by pride. They could flawlessly judge others according to the law, for sure, but they could not see the reality of their own spiritual condition. Their immense knowledge basically just became a shield against ever having to look inward.
So, what's the fix? How on earth do we bridge this massive gap between knowing the right path and actually walking it? Well, it comes down to a really powerful concept called phronosis. This is practical wisdom. It's not just about having the raw intellect to solve a puzzle on a piece of paper, it's the lived art of making sound, practical judgments in the messy, everyday reality of a specific situation. It is the vital, necessary bridge between the head and the hands.
Let's see how this builds into real life. To cultivate this practical wisdom, you basically have to actively trick your brain into distancing itself from the emotion of any given situation. The ultimate hack for this? Ask yourself, would I accept this exact advice if it came from a caring friend? You essentially have to learn to become a fly on the wall of your own life. On top of that, we have to embrace regular correction from others and practice daily integrity. We need to let truth rule our own hearts just as strictly as we want it to rule our neighbors. So the crucial point is this. Overcoming this bias requires a pretty profound shift in perspective. As Papa's take so beautifully summarizes, self-awareness and the humility to be self-aware are the only ways to overcome this paradox. Without humility, guys, we are doomed to remain exactly like King Solomon, brilliant at diagnosing the world's problems while letting our own lives quietly fall apart in the background. We have to be willing to admit that our own vision is inherently flawed.
Which leaves us with one final, lingering thought to chew on. The very next time you find yourself offering a brilliantly solid piece of advice to someone you care about, just pause. Look inward for a second. Would you truly, honestly, accept and act on that exact same counsel if it came from a friend? It is a really tough question, but answering it honestly, that might just be the beginning of true wisdom.